Onias is 24 years old, a junior Levite whose life is measured by the rhythm of the temple and the slow, careful stroke of a reed pen. He stands on the eastern ridge of Jerusalem, the wind tugging at his simple linen tunic and the worn leather belt at his waist. He rubs his right thumb, where a faint stain of ink remains from a morning spent copying the ancient scrolls of the law. But his eyes are not on the scriptures now. They are fixed on the valley below, on the newly constructed Greek gymnasium that sits like a foreign scar upon the holy city. He watches with a focused, anxious expression as young men, some from the very priestly families he serves alongside, exercise in the Greek fashion, competing in the sun. To fit into this seductive Hellenistic world, some have even sought to hide the physical marks of their Jewish identity. For Onias, this is more than a change in fashion. It is the terrifying sensation that the ancient ways of his fathers are being erased by a tidal wave of foreign culture. We often speak of the 400 years of silence between the final words of the prophet Malachi and the birth of Jesus Christ, but for those living through it, the silence of God was deafeningly loud with the clattering of Greek shields and the sophisticated arguments of the Seleucid Empire. This was the great transition, the era when the stable, quiet Persian peace collapsed into a storm of Greek philosophy and imperial ambition. As a historian, I look at this gap and ask, how did the world of the Old Testament transform so radically into the world we find in the Gospels? To understand the landscape Jesus walked, we must first walk through the centuries that the Bible does not record in its primary canon, yet which shaped every stone and every soul in Judea. To many, these silent centuries appear as a void on the page, but as a historian, I see them as a crucible, a period of intense pressure that forged the very world Jesus would eventually enter. We are not left entirely in the dark. We have the vivid, often bloody accounts found in the first and second books of Maccabees and the expansive histories of Flavius Josephus, who wrote of these events with the benefit of hindsight. Archaeology, too, speaks where the scriptures are quiet. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has pulled back the curtain on the spiritual fervor of this time, showing us a people wrestling with their identity in the face of empire. Among scholars, there is a persistent debate regarding the reach of this Hellenization. Was the Greek influence restricted to the urban aristocrats and the junior priests Onias sees below him, or did it penetrate the lives of the common farmers in the Judean hills? The evidence in the soil is striking. We find the sudden appearance of Greek-style coinage and the remains of Hellenistic architecture, where once there was only the modest simplicity of the Persian era. For Onias, standing on that ridge with ink-stained fingers, this isn't a scholarly question. It is a lived reality. We will follow him as he navigates the collapse of the long Persian peace and the rising Greek storm that would forever alter the path of his people. Onias's grandfather used to speak of a different world, a time of quiet restoration that felt as though it would last forever. In the generations following the return from exile under Nehemiah and Ezra, Judea had existed as a humble, semi-autonomous province under the vast wing of the Persian Empire. This was a period of relative stability where the priesthood maintained the temple and the law without the constant threat of cultural erasure. We see the reality of this era in the archaeology of the soil, specifically in the Yehud coins. These small silver pieces minted in Judea during the Persian period are physical witnesses to a people allowed to manage their own local economy and religious identity under Persian oversight. To Onias, whose thumb carries the ink of the scrolls he copies, these stories of the Persian peace represent a lost anchor of order, but that peace was shattered in 332 BC by a figure who seemed more like a force of nature than a man, Alexander the Great. As a young man, Onias likely listened with wide eyes as the elders recounted the day the Greek phalanxes marched down the coastal plains. The ancient historians Arrian and Plutarch describe Alexander's campaigns in the Levant as a whirlwind of steel and ambition that nothing could withstand. We can only infer the psychological and spiritual shock this caused a people who believed the Persian Empire was the final, unshakable word in world power. Its sudden collapse was more than a political shift. It was a crisis of certainty. It was the realization that the world could be remade in an instant by a king from the west who did not know the God of Israel. The storm had arrived, and the dust of those marching Greeks would eventually settle into every corner of the world Onias now inhabits. After Alexander's sudden death in Babylon, his vast empire did not crumble into nothingness. Instead, it was carved up by his warring generals, the Diadochi. From the chaos of their struggle, a new world order emerged, unified not by a single crown, but by a single tongue, Koine Greek. This common Greek became the connective tissue of the Mediterranean, bridging the gap between isolated Judean villages and the great marble cities of the East. It was the language of the marketplace, the court, and the philosopher's porch. In the great library city of Alexandria, this linguistic shift produced one of the most significant literary events in history. To serve a growing Jewish diaspora that was beginning to lose its grasp of ancestral Hebrew, the Torah was translated into Greek. This version, known as the Septuagint, was more than a mere convenience. It was a bridge. For the first time, the sacred history and the radical monotheism of Israel were accessible to the entire Greco-Roman world. External sources and historical records show that this translation became the primary scripture for many Jews of the period, eventually becoming the text most often quoted by the writers of the New Testament. Looking back, as a historian and a man of faith, I see a profound irony in this supposed silence of God. While no new prophets were walking the streets of Jerusalem to deliver, "Thus says the Lord," the very tools needed for the future spread of the gospel were being forged in the fires of Hellenism. A universal language was being prepared so that when the Word eventually became flesh, the message of his arrival could travel from the Judean hills to the ends of the earth with unprecedented speed and clarity. If you want to go beyond this episode and see the wider historical world around the Bible, I gathered these studies in my book. There I go deeper into maps, empires, chronology, sources, and disputed questions that cannot fit fully into one video. The link to the book is in the description. Now let us return to the person at the center of this story and to the world he had to live through. Onias stands in the quiet of a small scriptorium, his right hand resting on a fragment of a Greek scroll. The ink stain on his thumb, earned from hours of meticulously copying the ancient Hebrew characters of the prophets, contrasts sharply with the smooth rhythmic curves of the Greek text before him. He is a man caught between two worlds. He is captivated by the precision and the sheer beauty of the Greek language, its ability to capture subtle nuances of thought and philosophical depth, yet he feels a cold shiver of dread. He knows that with the language comes a Greek way of thinking that prioritizes human reason and physical aesthetics over divine decree and the holiness of the heart. For a junior priest like Onias, this scroll is a siren song, a beautiful vessel that he fears might just carry the seeds of his people's spiritual undoing. He senses that the storm is no longer just on the horizon. It is beginning to whisper through the very gates of the temple. The whispers Onias feared soon became a deafening roar. In 175 BC, a new shadow fell over Judea in the form of Antiochus IV, a Seleucid king who styled himself Epiphanes, meaning the manifest God. Unlike the Persian kings who had allowed for religious autonomy, Antiochus viewed the cultural and religious diversity of his subjects as a structural weakness. To unify a fracturing empire, he demanded a single culture, a single law, and a single set of gods. The external record in the first book of Maccabees preserves the chilling details of his decree. The king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that each should give up his own customs. For the Jewish people, this was not merely a change in administration, it was an existential threat. The decree demanded the abolition of the Sabbath, the burning of the Torah scrolls, and the cessation of the daily sacrifices that had defined the life of the nation since the days of Ezra. Onias stood in the inner court of the temple, his linen tunic damp with the sweat of cold terror. He watched as soldiers, speaking that beautiful Greek language he had once studied with such curiosity, hauled heavy dressed stones into the sacred precinct. With rhythmic, mechanical efficiency, they erected a pagan altar directly over the great altar of burnt offering. This is the moment history and prophecy call the Abomination of Desolation. To a Levite like Onias, whose life was measured by the rhythm of the morning and evening lambs, the sight was a spiritual execution. The air, once thick with the scent of frankincense offered to the Most High, was now fouled by the smoke of swine sacrificed to Olympian Zeus. Archaeology confirms the violent reality of this era. Excavations in Jerusalem and the surrounding Judean hills have revealed distinct destruction layers dating precisely to the mid-2nd century BC, layers of ash, broken masonry, and scorched earth that speak of a city under siege from within and without. Yet a significant scholarly debate remains regarding the true catalyst of this horror. Was Antiochus simply a megalomaniac driven by imperial ego, or, as some historians argue, was he invited into this radical intervention by a wealthy, Hellenizing elite within Jerusalem? These pro-Greek factions may have sought to use the king's power to crush their traditionalist rivals in a bloody internal civil war. For Onias, standing amidst the ruins of his vocation and the desecration of his God's house, the political cause mattered far less than the devastating consequence. The holy place was defiled, and the long silence of the centuries had been replaced by the screams of those who refused to bow. He realized that the time for scrolls and ink had passed. The time for a different kind of sacrifice had begun. The silence in the temple was no longer a holy quiet. It was the silence of a tomb. For Onias, the choice was binary: stay and serve a desecrated altar under the watchful eyes of Seleucid guards, or abandon the only life he had ever known. News had reached the city of Aspark in the village of Modin, where an aged priest named Mattathias had refused to bow, and his son Judas, called the Hammer, was gathering the faithful in the hills. Onias felt the weight of his linen tunic, now stained with the dust of the road rather than the soot of the altar. In a moment of quiet, desperate resolve, he discarded his incense shovel, the tool of his family's ancient mediation, and replaced it with a simple leather sling and a pouch of smooth stones gathered from the wadis. The external record in the second book of Maccabees provides a vivid account of the struggle that followed. It describes a guerrilla war fought not on the open plains where the Greek phalanxes and cavalry excelled, but in the jagged limestone ravines of the Judean wilderness. Archaeology offers a window into this survival. We find the early Hasmonean footprints in the desert fortresses of Dak and Hyrcania. These were not yet the grand palaces of later kings, but rugged refuges where men like Onias could watch the mountain passes and strike at the supply lines of an empire. When the rebels finally fought their way back into Jerusalem in 164 BC, the task was one of purification. It is important to distinguish the historical layers here. While later rabbinic tradition in the Talmud records the miracle of the oil that burned for 8 days, the earliest contemporary sources focus on the military victory and the urgent necessity of rededicating the altar. For Onias, the celebration of the first Hanukkah was not about a legend of light, but the hard-won reality of a covenant preserved. He stood in the courtyard, his hands calloused from the sling, but his heart returning to the liturgy, believing the storm had passed and the dawn of a new holy kingdom had arrived. The victory of the Maccabees birthed a period of Jewish independence that had not been seen for centuries, yet for Onias, now an elderly man with silver hair and a gait slowed by the years, the triumph felt increasingly hollow. He walked the temple courts once again as a senior priest, watching as the Hasmonean family transitioned from guerrilla leaders to a royal dynasty. Archaeology provides a tangible record of this shift in the coinage of the era. Early Hasmonean coins often featured humble Jewish symbols like the lily or the cornucopia with Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions, but as the decades passed, the coins began to mirror the very Hellenistic world they had fought to expel, eventually featuring Greek titles and royal diadems. To Onias, the ink stain on his thumb, still a persistent mark of his devotion to the scrolls, now felt like a relic of a simpler, purer time before the liberators had taken the crown. He watched with a heavy heart as the high priesthood, an office he considered a sacred trust from God, became a political prize to be bought, sold, or seized by the Hasmonean kings through intrigue and even assassination. This was the tragic irony of the era. The family that had saved the temple was now polluting its leadership, adopting the courtly lifestyles and cultural fashions of the Greeks they had once resisted. Scholarly debate often centers on how this internal corruption fractured Jewish society, sparking the rise of the distinct sects that would eventually define the world of the New Testament. We see the Pharisees emerging as guardians of the law for the common people, the Sadducees representing the wealthy priestly elite, and the Essenes, perhaps the most disillusioned of all, retreating into the desert wilderness, believing the temple had been defiled by these illegitimate priest kings. For Onias, standing in the shadow of the massive stone colonnades, the silence of God felt heavier than it had during the persecution. It was the silence of a people who had gained their freedom only to lose their way. The internal rot of the Hasmonean dynasty eventually invited an external predator. In the year 63, before Christ, the Roman general Pompey the Great arrived at the gates of Jerusalem, not as a liberator, but as an arbiter of a bitter civil war between two Hasmonean brothers. Onias, now in the twilight of his life, his hands trembling as he gripped his staff, watched from the temple precincts as the Roman legions began their siege. The air was filled with a sound unlike anything he had heard in the days of the Greeks, the mechanical, rhythmic thud of Roman engineering. Archaeologists have found the physical evidence of this violence near the base of the Temple Mount walls. Heavy spherical ballista stones, carved from local limestone, launched by Roman catapults to shatter the resolve of the city's defenders. For Onias, the final blow was not the breach of the walls, but the violation of the sanctuary itself. The historian Flavius Josephus provides a chilling account of Pompey's entry into the temple. After the slaughter of the priests who refused to stop their liturgy even as the swords fell, Pompey did the unthinkable. He pushed aside the heavy veil and stepped into the Holy of Holies. It was a place where only the high priest could go, once a year, with fear and trembling. Onias would have felt the world tilt on its axis at such a sacrilege. Yet Josephus records a detail that resonates with a strange, haunting power. Pompey found the room entirely empty. There was no statue of a god, no golden idol, only a profound and mysterious vacancy. To the Roman, it was a curiosity. To a man like Onias, it was a reminder that the God of Israel could not be captured by stones or empires. As Judea was stripped of its independence and transformed into a client kingdom of the Roman eagle, Onias's final years were marked by a new kind of silence. The Hasmonean crown was gone, and in its place stood the shadow of Rome. We can infer that in these dark years, the frustration of the people began to crystallize into a singular, desperate hope. The political failures of the Maccabean descendants fueled a deep, burning longing for a son of David, a true king who would not only overthrow the Roman eagle but would restore the purity of the heart. Onias, with the ink stain still faint on his thumb, represent the generation that died waiting, looking toward the horizon for a morning star that had not yet risen, unaware that the very roads the Romans were building and the language the Greeks had spread were preparing the way for the one they sought. Looking back from my vantage point as a historian, I see that what men like Onias perceived as a divine silence was, in reality, the most intense period of preparation in human history. The Apostle Paul would later call this the fullness of time, a moment when every geopolitical and cultural thread was woven together for a single purpose. The world was transforming into a stage perfectly set for a story yet to be told. Rome provided the stage, the Pax Romana, and a vast network of stone roads that would eventually carry the feet of messengers to the ends of the earth. Greece provided the script, the Koine Greek language, a universal tongue that allowed ideas to bypass ethnic borders. And the Maccabean struggle, which Onias had witnessed in its agonizing birth, had preserved the Jewish identity, ensuring that the monotheistic flame was not extinguished by the winds of Hellenism. Archaeology confirms that this was a period of structural evolution for the faith. Consider the Theodotus Inscription, a limestone slab found on the Ophel Hill in Jerusalem. It dates to just before the New Testament era and records the establishment of a synagogue for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments. In the Old Testament, the temple was the singular sun around which all life orbited. But in these silent years, the synagogue emerged as the local heartbeat of Jewish life, the very place where a carpenter from Nazareth would one day stand to unroll the scroll of Isaiah. We must also recognize a historical fact often overlooked. While the voice of the prophets had indeed fallen silent after Malachi, the work of the scribes had never been more feverish. They were not receiving new visions, but they were preserving the old ones with a precision that borders on the miraculous, ensuring that the texts Jesus would eventually quote were sharpened and ready. By the end of Onias's life, the world had become a paradox. It was politically Roman, culturally Greek, and religiously expectant, a world holding its breath for a promise it could feel but not yet see. Onias sits now by the eastern gate of Jerusalem, his back against the sun-warmed stone. He is an old man, his once dark hair now the color of the dust on the Jericho road, and his hands, still faintly marked by a lifetime of ink, tremble slightly as he adjusts his worn cloak. He watches the Roman soldiers patrol the walls with a weary indifference. He will not live to see the star rise over Bethlehem, nor will he hear the cry of a child in a manger. He is part of that hidden, faithful generation known as the quiet in the land, those who lived and died in the shadow of empires, clutching the scrolls and waiting for what the scriptures call the consolation of Israel. When we look at the transition from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New, the landscape seems unrecognizable. We left a world of Persian governors and small tribal returns. We enter a world of Roman legions, Greek philosophy, and a high priesthood entangled in global politics. Without these 4 centuries, the bridge that Onias walked, the world of Jesus would be an incomprehensible mystery. These years were the crucible where the synagogue was born, where the Hebrew scriptures were translated for the world, and where the hope of a Messiah was refined in the fires of Greek and Roman oppression. As a historian and a person of faith, I am often struck by the realization that God's silence is rarely an absence of action. To Onias, it may have felt like a long, cold night, but in the divine economy, it was the dawn's preparation. The silence was not a void. It was the tension of a bowstring being drawn back, gathering the energy required to launch the gospel into every corner of the known world. The stage was set, the language was ready, and the hearts of the people were desperate. If you want to continue this journey more deeply, my book is available through the link in the description. In the next episode, we will move to another moment where faith, imperial power, and historical evidence meet in a particularly sharp way.